The military academy in Ouagadougou was a world apart from university life. When Ibrahim Traoré reported for officer training in 2015, he traded academic discussions for dawn drills, comfortable dormitories for Spartan barracks, and intellectual debates for military discipline. The rigorous training pushed him to his physical and mental limits while teaching him leadership skills that no classroom could provide. His fellow cadets came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared common concerns about their country's security challenges. Burkina Faso faced growing threats from terrorist groups operating across the Sahel region, and the military was struggling to adapt to new forms of warfare that conventional training had not prepared them for. Ibrahim approached military training with the same analytical mindset he had applied to geology. He studied not just tactics and weapon systems, but also the underlying causes of conflict and instability. He understood that military solutions alone could not address the complex challenges facing the region, which included poverty, youth unemployment, weak governance, and competition for natural resources. During field exercises, Ibrahim demonstrated exceptional leadership abilities. Unlike some officers who relied on rank to command respect, he earned loyalty through competence and genuine concern for his soldiers' welfare. He had an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure and to make sound decisions even in chaotic situations. His superiors noticed his potential early in his training. Ibrahim was selected for specialized courses in counterterrorism and unconventional warfare, training that would prove crucial in the years ahead. He also participated in joint exercises with military forces from other African countries and Western nations, gaining exposure to different approaches to security challenges. The theoretical aspects of military strategy fascinated Ibrahim, but he was equally interested in understanding the human dimensions of conflict. He spent time talking with experienced soldiers who had served in peacekeeping missions across Africa, learning about the complexities of operating in environments where the lines between civilian and combatant, friend and enemy were often blurred. After completing officer training, Ibrahim was assigned to a unit responsible for border security in the northern regions of Burkina Faso. This posting gave him first-hand experience with the security challenges that were increasingly threatening the country's stability. The border areas were vast, sparsely populated, and difficult to patrol effectively with limited resources. The young lieutenant quickly realized that traditional military approaches were inadequate for dealing with the threats his country faced. Terrorist groups operated like guerrillas, blending into local populations and using intimate knowledge of terrain to evade government forces. They exploited ethnic tensions, economic grievances, and weak state capacity to recruit followers and establish safe havens. Ibrahim's approach to these challenges differed from that of many of his colleagues. While some officers focused primarily on military tactics, he emphasized the importance of understanding local communities and addressing the root causes that made people vulnerable to extremist recruitment. He spent considerable time talking with village elders, religious leaders, and young people to understand their concerns and perspectives. This community-focused approach proved effective in areas under his command. Rather than treating all civilians with suspicion, Ibrahim worked to build trust and cooperation. He organized programs that provided alternative opportunities for young people who might otherwise be tempted by extremist groups. These initiatives included vocational training, small business support, and community development projects. The success of Ibrahim's methods attracted attention from his superiors and international partners working in the region. His ability to combine military effectiveness with community engagement made him a valuable asset in counterterrorism operations. He was promoted rapidly and given increasing responsibilities for operations in some of the country's most challenging areas. However, Ibrahim's experiences in the field also exposed him to the limitations and contradictions within Burkina Faso's security apparatus. He witnessed corruption that diverted resources from frontline troops to personal enrichment. He saw how political interference sometimes prevented effective military operations. Most troubling, he observed how some leaders seemed more interested in maintaining power than in actually solving the country's security problems. These observations reinforced Ibrahim's belief that military success depended on good governance and genuine commitment to serving the people. He began to understand that the security challenges facing Burkina Faso were symptoms of deeper problems in how the country was governed and how decisions were made. As his reputation grew, Ibrahim was selected for advanced training programs abroad. He studied at military academies in several countries, gaining exposure to different leadership philosophies and operational approaches. These experiences broadened his perspective and reinforced his conviction that effective leadership required both technical competence and moral integrity. The period from 2018 to 2020 was particularly challenging for Burkina Faso's military. Terrorist attacks increased in frequency and sophistication, and government forces struggled to respond effectively. The human cost was enormous, with soldiers and civilians alike paying the price for inadequate equipment, poor planning, and sometimes incompetent leadership. Ibrahim found himself increasingly frustrated with the gap between what needed to be done and what was actually being accomplished. He saw talented young officers leaving the military in frustration, while incompetent leaders remained in positions of authority because of political connections rather than merit. The country's security situation continued to deteriorate, despite the sacrifices of dedicated soldiers. The tipping point came in January 2022, when a military coup brought Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba to power. The coup leaders justified their actions by citing the previous government's failure to address the security crisis effectively. Ibrahim, by then a captain, found himself part of a military establishment that had taken direct control of the country. Initially, there was hope that military leadership might bring the focus and decisiveness needed to address Burkina Faso's challenges. However, as months passed, it became clear that changing the government's composition had not automatically solved the underlying problems. The security situation remained dire, and the new military leadership seemed to struggle with the same issues that had plagued their predecessors. Ibrahim watched these developments with growing concern. He understood that military coups, even when motivated by genuine grievances, rarely produced lasting solutions to complex problems. His experiences had taught him that effective governance required more than good intentions, or even military competence. It required a clear vision, popular support, and the ability to build institutions that could function effectively over time. By September 2022, dissatisfaction with Damiba's leadership was growing within the military ranks. Young officers who had initially supported the coup began to question whether it had achieved its stated objectives. The security situation remained critical, and there were signs that the new leadership was becoming as disconnected from frontline realities as their predecessors had been. Ibrahim found himself at the center of discussions among junior officers about the need for new leadership. His reputation for competence, integrity, and genuine concern for both soldiers and civilians made him a natural focal point for these conversations. The young captain who had once studied rocks and minerals was being asked to consider taking on responsibilities that could reshape his country's destiny. The morning of September 30th, 2022, began like any other in Ouagadougou, but by evening, Burkina Faso had a new leader. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, at just 34 years old, had become the world's youngest head of state after successfully leading a military takeover that removed Lieutenant Colonel Damiba from power. The decision to act had not been taken lightly. For weeks, Ibrahim and a group of like-minded young officers had watched with growing alarm as the security situation continued to deteriorate under Damiba's leadership. Terrorist attacks were becoming more frequent and deadly, while government forces seemed increasingly demoralized and ineffective. The promises made during the January coup had not been fulfilled, and public confidence was eroding rapidly. The final straw came when reports reached Ibrahim about a particularly devastating attack on a military convoy in the north. Dozens of soldiers had been killed or wounded in an ambush that many believed could have been prevented with better intelligence, equipment, and leadership. The families of fallen soldiers were demanding answers, while surviving troops questioned whether their leaders truly understood the challenges they faced. Ibrahim's colleagues had been urging him to take action for some time. His reputation within the military was exceptional, and many believed he represented the kind of leadership the country desperately needed. However, Ibrahim himself had been reluctant to pursue power, understanding the enormous responsibilities and challenges that would come with leading a country facing such severe problems. The coup itself was swift and relatively bloodless. Ibrahim and his supporters moved decisively to secure key installations in the capital, while simultaneously announcing their intentions to the public. Unlike previous military takeovers that had often been chaotic and violent, this transition was marked by careful planning and clear communication about the reasons for change. In his first address to the nation, Ibrahim spoke not as a conqueror but as a servant. He explained that the military action had been necessary because of the previous government's failure to address the security crisis effectively. However, he also acknowledged that military coups were not ideal solutions to political problems and committed to working toward a return to constitutional governance once stability had been restored. The young president's approach differed markedly from that of previous military leaders. Rather than surrounding himself with cronies or making grand promises that could not be kept, Ibrahim focused on practical measures that could produce immediate improvements in people's lives. He visited military installations to assess conditions firsthand, met with community leaders to understand their concerns, and began implementing reforms to address corruption and inefficiency. One of his first major initiatives was a comprehensive review of military strategy and operations. Ibrahim understood that defeating terrorist groups required more than just superior firepower. It demanded better intelligence, improved coordination between different security agencies, and above all, the support of local communities who could provide information and deny safe haven to extremists. He personally led efforts to boost military morale by ensuring that soldiers had adequate equipment, regular pay, and proper medical care for wounded personnel. These seemingly simple measures had a dramatic impact on military effectiveness, as troops who felt valued and supported were more willing to take risks and make sacrifices in the field. Ibrahim's leadership style was characterized by accessibility and authenticity. Unlike previous leaders who remained isolated in luxury, he maintained a simple lifestyle and continued to interact regularly with ordinary soldiers and citizens. He could often be found visiting military bases, talking with farmers in rural areas, or meeting with students and civil society leaders in the capital. This hands-on approach allowed him to maintain direct contact with the realities facing his country. He understood that effective leadership required constant feedback and adjustment, and he was not afraid to admit mistakes or change course when circumstances demanded it. This flexibility and humility set him apart from many African leaders who had become rigid and disconnected from their people. The international community's response to Ibrahim's rise to power was initially cautious. Western governments and international organizations had grown weary of military coups in West Africa and were reluctant to legitimize yet another unconstitutional change of government. However, they also recognized that Burkina Faso's stability was crucial for regional security and that Ibrahim represented a potentially positive change from previous leadership. Ibrahim's approach to international relations was pragmatic and independent. He understood that Burkina Faso needed external support to address its security challenges, but he was determined to ensure that such cooperation served his country's interests rather than those of foreign powers. He sought partnerships with multiple countries and organizations, avoiding exclusive dependence on any single ally. His youth became both an asset and a challenge in international diplomacy. Older leaders sometimes underestimated him because of his age, but Ibrahim's intelligence, preparation, and clear vision for his country's future gradually earned respect on the global stage. He had an unusual ability to articulate complex issues in clear, compelling terms that resonated with both domestic and international audiences. Domestically, Ibrahim's presidency marked a dramatic shift in how government operated. He streamlined bureaucratic processes, eliminated many of the privileges and perks that had insulated previous leaders from reality, and demanded accountability from all government officials. Ministers and civil servants who failed to perform were quickly replaced. Regardless of their political connections or personal relationships, the new president also prioritized transparency in government operations. He regularly held press conferences to explain policy decisions, published detailed information about government spending, and established mechanisms for citizens to report corruption or inefficiency. These measures helped restore public confidence in government institutions and created pressure for improved performance throughout the administration. Perhaps most importantly, Ibrahim demonstrated that it was possible to combine strong leadership with genuine humility. He never forgot his humble origins or the sacrifices that had made his education and career possible. This authenticity resonated powerfully with ordinary citizens who had grown tired of leaders who seemed more interested in personal enrichment than public service. As his first year in office progressed, the improvements in Burkina Faso's security situation became increasingly evident. Terrorist attacks declined in frequency and effectiveness, while government forces showed improved coordination and morale. More importantly, communities in previously unstable areas began to report feeling safer and more confident about the future. The transformation was not just military, but also social and economic. Ibrahim's government launched programs to address youth unemployment, improve educational opportunities, and support small businesses. These initiatives were designed not just to provide immediate relief, but to address some of the underlying conditions that had made the country vulnerable to extremist recruitment. By early 2024, international observers were beginning to take notice of the remarkable changes occurring in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim's leadership. The young president, who had emerged from a small village to lead his country, was proving that age was no barrier to effective leadership and that authentic commitment to public service could produce extraordinary results. The University of Ouagadougou buzzed with intellectual energy when Ibrahim Traoré first stepped onto its campus in 2008. The sprawling institution, with its modern buildings and bustling courtyards, felt like entering another world compared to his rural upbringing. Students from across West Africa mingled in animated discussions about politics, economics, and the future of the continent. Ibrahim chose to study geology, a field that fascinated him because it dealt with the Earth's hidden treasures. Burkina Faso was rich in gold and other minerals, yet most of its people remained poor. He wanted to understand this paradox and perhaps find ways to ensure that natural resources benefited ordinary citizens rather than just foreign corporations and corrupt politicians. His professors quickly noticed his analytical mind and his ability to ask probing questions that others missed. While classmates focused on technical aspects of their studies, Ibrahim always connected geological concepts to broader social and economic issues. During field trips to mining sites, he observed not just rock formations, but also the living conditions of workers and the environmental impact of extraction operations. The contrast was stark and troubling. International mining companies operated state-of-the-art facilities that generated enormous profits, while local communities lived in poverty despite sitting atop vast mineral wealth. Workers toiled in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered basic needs, while executives in air-conditioned offices made decisions that affected thousands of lives. These observations deepened Ibrahim's understanding of how economic systems could be manipulated to benefit the few at the expense of the many. He began attending student political meetings, not as a passionate activist but as a careful observer, trying to understand the mechanisms of power and change. The political climate in Burkina Faso during Ibrahim's university years was tense. President Blaise Compaoré had ruled the country for over 2 decades, and signs of discontent were growing among the population. Rising food prices, youth unemployment, and perceived corruption fueled widespread frustration. Students, traditionally at the forefront of political movements in Africa, began organizing protests and discussions about democratic reform. Ibrahim's approach to student politics differed from that of his peers. While others gave fiery speeches and organized dramatic demonstrations, he preferred to listen, analyze, and build consensus. He had an unusual ability to find common ground between opposing factions and to present complex ideas in simple terms that everyone could understand. His reputation as a thoughtful leader grew gradually. Fellow students began seeking his advice on various issues, from academic problems to political strategies. Ibrahim never tried to dominate these discussions, but rather asked questions that helped others think through problems more clearly. This collaborative leadership style would later become one of his defining characteristics. During his 3rd year at university, Ibrahim joined the Geology Club and was eventually elected as its president. Under his leadership, the club expanded beyond academic activities to include community service projects. They organized field trips where students taught local communities about sustainable mining practices and environmental protection. These initiatives caught the attention of both university administrators and government officials. The experience of leading the geology club taught Ibrahim valuable lessons about motivation and team building. He learned that true leadership meant empowering others to achieve their potential, rather than simply giving orders. He discovered that when people understood the purpose behind their actions and felt valued for their contributions, they would go beyond expectations to achieve common goals. As his university years progressed, Ibrahim's vision for his country's future became clearer. He saw Burkina Faso's potential not just in its mineral wealth but in its people, particularly its youth. However, he also recognized that realizing this potential required fundamental changes in how the country was governed and how its resources were managed. The turning point came during his final year when widespread protests erupted across the country. The immediate trigger was President Compaoré's attempt to change the constitution to extend his rule beyond the legal limit. Students, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens took to the streets in unprecedented numbers, demanding democratic change. Ibrahim found himself at the center of these events, not by seeking the spotlight, but because his fellow students naturally looked to him for guidance. His ability to remain calm under pressure and to think strategically made him an effective coordinator of student activities. He helped organize peaceful protests, negotiate with university administrators, and maintain dialogue between different student factions. The protests culminated in October 2014, when President Compaoré was forced to resign and flee the country. The success of the popular uprising, known as the Burkinabe Uprising, demonstrated the power of organized citizen action. For Ibrahim, it was a practical lesson in how determined people could change seemingly unchangeable systems. However, the aftermath of Compaoré's departure also revealed the challenges of political transition. Different groups had competing visions for the country's future, and without strong institutions there was a risk of chaos or the emergence of new forms of authoritarianism. Ibrahim watched these developments with keen interest, understanding that successful change required more than just removing bad leaders. As he completed his geology degree, Ibrahim faced important decisions about his future. He had job offers from mining companies that would provide financial security and professional success. His family expected him to use his education to escape poverty and achieve personal prosperity. The conventional path would have been to take a well-paying job, perhaps eventually starting his own consulting firm. But Ibrahim's experiences had convinced him that he had a responsibility to contribute to his country's development in a more direct way. The lessons from his grandmother's sacrifice, his observations of inequality, and his involvement in the student movement had shaped his understanding of leadership and service. Instead of pursuing private sector opportunities, Ibrahim made a decision that surprised many who knew him. He chose to join the military, specifically seeking training that would prepare him to serve his country in whatever capacity might be needed. This choice reflected his growing belief that true leadership required sacrifice and that protecting his nation might require more than academic knowledge or good intentions. The young man who had once dreamed of becoming a successful geologist was evolving into something different, someone who understood that his country's future depended on leaders willing to put service above personal gain. The dusty streets of Bondoukoui, a small village in Burkina Faso, seemed an unlikely place to birth a future president. Yet in 1988, when Ibrahim Traoré took his first breath, the winds of change were already stirring across West Africa. His father, a humble farmer who worked the red earth with calloused hands, never imagined his son would one day shake the very foundations of African politics. Growing up in a modest mud brick house with a corrugated iron roof, Ibrahim learned his first lessons not from textbooks but from watching his community struggle. The village had no electricity, and clean water came from a well that often ran dry during the harsh dry season. Children walked barefoot to a school that had more holes in its walls than windows, where one teacher tried to educate dozens of eager minds with nothing but chalk and determination. Ibrahim's mother, Mariam, possessed an unusual gift for storytelling. Each evening, as the family gathered around a flickering kerosene lamp, she would weave tales of ancient African kingdoms where young warriors rose from nothing to become great leaders. These stories planted seeds in Ibrahim's imagination, showing him that greatness could emerge from the humblest beginnings. The young boy displayed an unusual curiosity about the world beyond his village. While other children played with makeshift toys carved from wood, Ibrahim collected discarded newspapers that occasionally found their way to Bondokui. He taught himself to read better by studying these papers, learning about distant countries and their leaders. His questions often puzzled the village elders. Why did some countries have so much while others had so little? Why did leaders in faraway places make decisions that affected people they had never met? When Ibrahim turned 12, a government official visited Bondokui to announce a new education program. The man arrived in a shiny car that kicked up clouds of dust, wearing clothes that cost more than most families earned in a year. He spoke of progress and development, making grand promises about schools and hospitals. The villagers listened with hope in their eyes, but Ibrahim noticed something different. He saw the gap between the official's words and the reality around him. The promised improvements never materialized. The school remained a crumbling structure, and the nearest hospital was still a day's journey away on rough roads that became impassable during the rainy season. This early encounter with broken political promises left a deep impression on the young Ibrahim. He began to understand that words without action were meaningless, and that real change required more than speeches. Despite the challenges, Ibrahim excelled in his studies. His teachers recognized his exceptional intelligence and encouraged him to pursue higher education. However, his family's financial situation made this dream seem impossible. The cost of secondary school in the regional capital was beyond their means, and university seemed as distant as the moon. It was then that Ibrahim's grandmother, a woman whose weathered face held the wisdom of 8 decades, made a decision that would change everything. She had been saving small amounts of money for years, hiding coins in a clay pot buried beneath her hut. This secret fund, accumulated through selling vegetables at the local market and making traditional crafts, represented her life savings. One hot afternoon, she called Ibrahim aside and pressed the worn pot into his hands. Inside were enough coins and crumpled bills to cover his first year of secondary school. Through tears, she told him that education was the only inheritance she could give him, but it was more valuable than land or livestock. She made him promise that he would use his knowledge not just to better himself, but to help others climb out of poverty. This sacrifice ignited a fire in Ibrahim's heart. He understood that his education represented not just his own dreams, but the hopes of his entire community. Every lesson learned, every book read, every exam passed was a step toward fulfilling his grandmother's faith in him. At secondary school in the regional capital, Ibrahim encountered new challenges. Many of his classmates came from wealthy families and looked down on the village boy, with his patched clothes and simple manners. Rather than feeling ashamed, Ibrahim used their condescension as motivation. He studied harder than anyone else, often reading by candlelight long after his dorm mates had fallen asleep. His exceptional performance caught the attention of his teachers, who began to see in him the potential for something extraordinary. They encouraged him to think beyond personal success and consider how he might contribute to his country's development. These conversations planted new seeds in Ibrahim's mind, expanding his vision from helping his village to serving his entire nation. The transformation was gradual, but profound. The shy village boy began to develop the confidence and leadership skills that would later captivate a nation. He organized study groups for struggling students, mediated conflicts between classmates from different ethnic backgrounds, and even convinced school administrators to start a scholarship fund for poor students. As Ibrahim prepared for university entrance exams, he carried with him more than just academic knowledge. He bore the weight of his community's expectations, his grandmother's sacrifice, and his own growing understanding of the challenges facing Burkina Faso. The foundation was being laid for a remarkable journey that would eventually lead him from the dusty villages of his childhood to the highest office in the land. The young man who had once collected discarded newspapers in a remote village was beginning to understand that real power lay not in the positions people held, but in their ability to inspire others and create meaningful change. This realization would guide him through the trials ahead and shape the leader he was destined to become. The transformation of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership became the subject of intense international attention throughout 2024. What had begun as another military coup in West Africa was evolving into something unprecedented, a genuine success story of youth leadership, innovative governance, and rapid national development. The security improvements that had marked Ibrahim's first year in office continued to accelerate. His comprehensive approach to counter-terrorism, which combined military operations with community engagement and economic development, proved remarkably effective. Regions that had been under constant threat from extremist groups began to experience sustained periods of peace and stability. The key to this success lay in Ibrahim's understanding that security was not just about military force but about creating conditions where terrorism could not take root. His government launched ambitious programs to provide education, health care, and economic opportunities in previously neglected rural areas. Young people who might have been vulnerable to extremist recruitment instead found themselves with genuine alternatives and reasons for hope. International military experts who had been skeptical of the young president's unconventional methods began to take notice. Major military academies started studying Burkina Faso's counterterrorism strategies, and other African countries requested assistance in implementing similar approaches. Ibrahim's model of combining security operations with development programs was being hailed as a breakthrough in addressing regional instability. The economic transformation was equally remarkable. Ibrahim's government had inherited a country with stagnant growth, high unemployment, and massive inequality. However, his focus on transparency, efficiency, and inclusive development began producing tangible results within months. Foreign investment increased as international businesses gained confidence in the country's stability and governance. The mining sector, which Ibrahim understood intimately from his geology background, underwent particular reform. New regulations ensured that a greater share of mineral wealth remained in the country and benefited local communities. International mining companies were required to invest in local infrastructure, education, and healthcare as conditions for their operating licenses. Agriculture, which employed the majority of Burkina Faso's population, received unprecedented government support. Ibrahim's administration provided farmers with improved seeds, fertilizers, and equipment, while also investing in irrigation systems and storage facilities. These measures not only increased food production, but also reduced rural poverty and unemployment. The social changes were perhaps the most striking aspect of Ibrahim's presidency. His emphasis on education and youth development had created a generation of young people who saw their country's future with optimism rather than despair. University enrollment increased dramatically, and new technical schools were established to provide practical skills training. Women's participation in government and business expanded significantly under Ibrahim's leadership. He appointed qualified women to key positions in his administration and supported programs to increase female entrepreneurship and education. This inclusive approach not only improved governance, but also demonstrated his commitment to utilizing all of his country's human resources. Healthcare improvements were another hallmark of the Traoré presidency. New clinics and hospitals were built in rural areas, while existing facilities received better equipment and staffing. Vaccination programs expanded, and maternal mortality rates began to decline for the first time in decades. These achievements were particularly meaningful to Ibrahim, who remembered the health challenges his own community had faced. During his childhood, the international community's perception of Ibrahim and Burkina Faso shifted dramatically as these results became evident. What had initially been viewed as another problematic military coup was increasingly recognized as a transformative moment in African governance. Diplomatic relations improved with Western countries, while African leaders began seeking Ibrahim's advice on addressing similar challenges in their own countries. His approach to international relations remained independent and principled. Ibrahim refused to become anyone's puppet, whether Western powers or other African strongmen. He maintained friendly relations with all countries willing to respect Burkina Faso's sovereignty, while clearly articulating his nation's interests and values on the global stage. The African Union, which had initially suspended Burkina Faso's membership following the coup, began reconsidering its position as Ibrahim's achievements became undeniable. His success challenged conventional wisdom about military governments and forced regional organizations to develop more nuanced approaches to unconstitutional changes of power. By mid-2024, Ibrahim's reputation had spread far beyond Africa. International media organizations began featuring stories about the young president who was defying expectations and transforming his country. Academic institutions invited him to speak about leadership and development, while policy experts studied his methods for potential application elsewhere. The most remarkable aspect of Ibrahim's success was his ability to maintain the humility and authenticity that had characterized his rise to power. Despite international acclaim and domestic popularity, he continued to live simply and remain accessible to ordinary citizens. He still visited military bases regularly, met with farmers and students, and maintained the hands-on leadership style that had made him effective. His speeches during this period reflected a mature understanding of both achievements and challenges ahead. Ibrahim never claimed that Burkina Faso's problems had been solved completely, but rather emphasized that sustainable progress required continued effort and vigilance. He spoke about the need for institutional reforms that would ensure good governance beyond any individual leader's tenure. The nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize that would be announced in early 2025 was already being discussed in international circles by late 2024. Ibrahim's combination of military success against terrorism, economic development, social progress, and peaceful governance had created a compelling case for recognition by the Nobel Committee. However, what made Ibrahim's story particularly compelling was not just his achievements but the journey that had brought him to this point. The village boy who had once collected discarded newspapers had become a leader whose vision and methods were being studied worldwide. His success demonstrated that transformative leadership could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that youth, rather than being a liability, could be a tremendous asset in addressing complex challenges. As 2024 drew to a close, Ibrahim Traoré had established himself as one of Africa's most influential leaders and a global symbol of effective governance. His story was inspiring young people across the continent and beyond to believe that they too could make meaningful contributions to their societies, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. The morning of January 15, 2025, brought news that would echo across Africa and around the world. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president who had transformed Burkina Faso from a failing state into a beacon of hope, had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. At 36 years old, he had become not only the youngest sitting head of state to receive this honor but also the first military leader in decades to be recognized by the Nobel Committee for contributions to peace and development. The announcement sent shockwaves through international diplomatic circles. The Nobel Committee's citation praised Ibrahim's extraordinary achievement in transforming conflict into cooperation, establishing security through inclusive governance, and demonstrating that youth leadership can address humanity's most pressing challenges. The committee specifically highlighted his innovative approach to counter-terrorism, his commitment to democratic values despite coming to power through military means, and his success in creating sustainable peace in one of the world's most volatile regions. In Ouagadougou, the news was received with celebrations that reflected the profound transformation the country had undergone. Streets that had once been dangerous after dark were now filled with jubilant crowds, celebrating their president's recognition. The contrast with just 3 years earlier, when the capital had been gripped by fear and uncertainty, could not have been more dramatic. The international media scrambled to understand how this remarkable transformation had occurred. Journalists who had covered Burkina Faso during its darkest periods returned to find a country they barely recognized. Schools that had been closed due to security threats were now overflow with eager students. Markets that had been empty were bustling with commerce. Villages that had been abandoned were being rebuilt by returning families. The statistics told the story of unprecedented progress. Terrorist incidents had declined by over 80% since Ibrahim took office. Economic growth had accelerated to levels not seen in decades. School enrollment had doubled, particularly among girls. Healthcare indicators showed dramatic improvements across all categories. Foreign investment had increased tenfold as international confidence in the country's stability grew. However, what impressed observers most was not just the quantitative improvements, but the qualitative changes in how Burkina Faso operated. Corruption, which had once been endemic, had largely disappeared from public institutions. Government services that had previously been inefficient and unreliable now functioned effectively. Most remarkably, there was a sense of national unity and purpose that had been absent for decades. Ibrahim's response to the Nobel nomination was characteristically humble and thoughtful. In his first public statement, he dedicated the honor to the people of Burkina Faso, particularly the young soldiers who had died fighting terrorism, and the ordinary citizens who had supported the transformation efforts despite enormous challenges. He emphasized that the nomination recognized not his individual achievements but the collective efforts of an entire nation to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The young president used the global attention generated by the nomination to advocate for broader changes in how the international community approached development and security challenges. He argued that sustainable peace required addressing root causes of conflict, rather than simply managing symptoms. His message resonated particularly strongly with other young African leaders who saw in his example proof that their generation could succeed. Where previous leaders had failed, Ibrahim's journey from village child to Nobel nominee had captured imaginations worldwide, but he remained focused on the work still ahead. In interviews following the nomination, he spoke candidly about the challenges that remained and the need for continued vigilance to maintain the progress achieved. He acknowledged that transforming a country was easier than sustaining that transformation over time. The nomination also highlighted broader questions about leadership, democracy, and development that Ibrahim's presidency had raised. His success challenged conventional wisdom about the relationship between democratic governance and effective leadership. While he had come to power through military means, his administration had demonstrated greater accountability, transparency, and responsiveness to citizen needs than many elected governments in the region. This paradox generated intense debate among political scientists, development experts, and democracy advocates. Some argued that Ibrahim's success proved that effective leadership mattered more than the process by which leaders came to power. Others contended that his achievements, however impressive, could not justify the precedent of